History remembers her quietly, too quietly. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, has long been wrapped in silk and silence. She was not beheaded like Anne. She was not banished like Catherine. She was not humiliated, divorced, imprisoned, or publicly discarded. No, Jane died in glory. They say she died a queen, the only one to give Henry what he wanted most, a son, and because of that, her story is told like a fairy tale brief. Gentle, convenient, but dig beneath the velvet. Lift the veil on those golden words, and something darker emerges. Something sharp, something soaked in blood. Jane Seymour did not die a peaceful queen. She died in agony, most likely torn open, perhaps even while still alive. She died in the same bed where she gave the king his heir, and while the country rang bells and shouted praise, Jane was screaming. It began on the 9th of October, in the year 1537. Jane, already exhausted from pregnancy, went into labor, and it did not stop. For 3 long days and 3 long nights, she writhed in pain. The records that survive are few and conflicting, but some say her body was physically pulled and stretched to make way for the child. One source, writing many decades later, claimed she begged her doctors to cut the baby out, to end her suffering. There is no confirmed record of a caesarean section performed on Jane Seymour, no surgical notes, no midwife's account. But the rumors never faded, and perhaps that is worse. Perhaps the absence of answers is its own kind of terror. The child Edward was born at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October. The son Henry had waited more than 2 decades for the child who would become Edward VI, the baby who would validate Henry's divorces, his break with Rome, his executions, his politics, his sins. Edward's first cry echoed through Hampton Court Palace like divine proof, and Jane smiled. They say Jane signed letters to announce the birth. Jane sat up and received guests. Jane was recovering, or so they wanted to believe. But something was wrong. Something had already broken. On the 15th of October, Jane was still in bed, smiling faintly, receiving well-wishers who had come for the christening. The fact that she was sitting up, some historians argue, proves that no caesarean occurred. Surely a woman who had been cut open could not be upright 3 days later. But others disagree. The human body, when pushed beyond its limits, sometimes behaves in strange, stubborn ways. And in Tudor England, the absence of recorded pain did not mean the pain did not exist. By the 19th of October, she began to decline. The fever returned. Her skin turned pale. Her hands trembled. She spoke less, smiled less. The women around her began to whisper. The doctors watched helplessly. Some thought it was puerperal fever. Others blamed the food she ate, the visitors who gave her cold, the midwives who failed to act in time. On the 20th, her condition worsened. Henry was summoned to her bedside. He came, he knelt, he prayed, he stayed for a time, then he left. In the early hours of the 24th of October, at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, the exact hour her son had been born 12 days earlier, Jane Seymour died. And here is where the story becomes colder than even her body. Her heart and entrails were removed. Her corpse was embalmed. She was dressed in a robe of gold. A crown was placed on her head. She was laid in state like a statue, no longer a woman, but an emblem. Her remaining body was eventually buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, but her heart was left behind, interred beneath the altar at Hampton Court. Split, divided, hidden. Henry did not attend her funeral. He ordered mourning. Of course, he wore purple while the court wore black. He arranged a procession. Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon, led the mourners, There were 29 women behind her, one for each year of Jane's short life. Bells rang in London for 6 hours. 200 masses were sung for her soul. The Duke of Norfolk oversaw the arrangements. Henry remained absent. He would later insist that Jane was his true wife, the only one he loved, the only one worthy to lie beside him in death. And yet, he never built the tomb he promised. The grand marble monument was sketched, proposed, but never finished. Jane lies beneath the stone floor at Windsor. In a simple vault, no statue, no verse, no crown above her bones. She gave him his son, and for that, she was honoured. But she also died in the act violently, perhaps unnecessarily, and for that, she was forgotten, cleaned up, wrapped in quiet, sealed beneath the page. This is the part they do not tell you, that the wife Henry claimed to love the most is also the one whose body was carved apart and buried in pieces, that the perfect queen may have screamed through her labour, may have begged to be cut, may have died, knowing that the man at her side had already chosen the child over her, that her death, just like her life, was never truly hers to hold. Tonight, we open that chamber again, not to condemn, not to excuse, but to remember, to tell the story not as a fairy tale, but as a reckoning. Jane Seymour gave England a king, and England, in return, gave her a grave. It began not with blood, but with waiting. A long, aching silence filled the rooms of Hampton Court as the Queen laboured behind thick wooden doors. Outside, the corridors were scrubbed, the tapestries dusted, the courtiers instructed to speak only in hopeful tones. But inside, where the smell of sweat and damp linens lingered, time had already begun to fracture. It was the 9th day of October, in the year 1537, and Jane Seymour, Queen of England, was in pain. They had been watching her closely for weeks, counting her breath, her appetite, the heaviness in her steps. She was pale, swollen, quiet the silence, not of fear, but of endurance. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment her body would fulfill its royal function. And so, the labour began, but it did not proceed as they had hoped. The contractions came hard and fast at first, then slowed, then came again with a vengeance. Jane, though quiet by nature, screamed. Some said the sound echoed down the stone corridors. Others said she bit down on cloth to muffle it. The women attending her midwives, trained in experience, not science, began whispering to each other, exchanging glances they did not dare share with the king. The child would not come easily. The child, the one England had waited for, seemed to resist the very world it was being forced into. Hours passed, then a day, then another. The Queen did not sleep. She drifted in and out of awareness, her body a battlefield, her breath ragged and unnatural. Her limbs were drawn up, then stretched again. She was turned, lifted, pressed. Some source, centurilateur. I would claim her body was physically pulled open, her legs and arms extended, the cervix manipulated, all in an effort to widen the passage for the prince. Whether that was true or not, no one could deny what her body endured. She wept. Or perhaps she didn't. The records don't say, but it is easy to imagine the tears, the prayers that fell between contractions. Perhaps she whispered the names of saints. Perhaps she begged her dead mother to watch over her. Perhaps she did nothing at all but grit her teeth and endure, because to scream too loudly was to admit weakness. And queens were not allowed to be weak, even in agony. Outside, Henry waited, not in pacing desperation, but with grim anticipation. He had been told of the complications, had heard the murmurs of distress behind the chamber doors. And then someone asked him a question that would shape the rest of Jane's short life. If only one could be saved, the queen or the child, which should it be? His answer, recorded coldly in later accounts, was as swift as it was brutal. The boy, he could find another wife. He said, but a son was everything. Back inside, the labor dragged into a third day. Her skin turned grey, her lips cracked. Her eyes rolled back in their sockets. Some said she began to hallucinate. Others claimed she begged the midwives to cut the child from her body, to open her up, to let her die, if only it meant he could live. There is no confirmed evidence of a caesarean section, but the stories endure, whispered like ghost tales around candlelight, of knives, of torn flesh, of a child lifted from a dying womb, of a woman broken open for the sake of a dynasty. And then, finally, at 2 in the morning on the 12th day of October, the prince was born. Edward, pale, small, alive. His cry filled the room with something close to relief. And Jane, they said, smiled. A weak, fleeting smile, more exhaled than expression. She had done it. She had given England its son. She had succeeded where Catherine and Anne had failed. For one radiant moment, she was not just a queen, she was the mother of a king. But victory came at a cost. Her body, so long battered by labor, had begun to slip into another state. Not recovery, but collapse. The bleeding had slowed, but her pulse was erratic. Her temperature climbed. The midwives said she was cleansing, that the fever would break. The doctors, what few existed, men still fumbling in the dark of medicine, prescribed broth and prayer. Jane, weak but lucid, signed letters announcing her son's birth. She received visitors. She sat up in bed, and all the while, inside her, something was festering. Perhaps it was puerperal fever, a common killer in a time when sanitation was a myth. Perhaps the uterus, torn and unhealed, had begun to rot. Perhaps her blood had turned against her, flooded with toxins. Or perhaps, as some claimed, her internal organs had already been compromised by what had occurred during childbirth. Whether by trauma or by surgical act, we will never know. But by the 15th of October, she began to fade. Her appetite disappeared. Her hands trembled. The visitors left. Her ladies sat in grim silence, sponging her forehead, whispering psalms. By the 19th, the fever had returned. This time, it did not recede. Her breathing became shallow. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She asked for her priest, and Henry was summoned. He entered the room in silence. He saw what remained of the woman he had married, the gentle face now slick with sweat, the once rosy skin pale and sunken. He knelt beside her bed. He kissed her hand. He did not rage. He did not demand a cure. He stayed. For a time, he prayed. And then, he left. On the night of the 23rd, the women said the Queen's breathing grew ragged. Her body was no longer fighting. She slipped into unconsciousness. The chamber was lit with candles. Prayers were murmured without cease. And then, at 2 in the morning on the 24th, exactly 12 days after her son's birth, exactly to the hour, Jane Seymour died. The chamber where she died remained sealed for some time. Cleaners came later, stripped the bedding, scrubbed the floor. The tapestries were replaced, but the smell, the heavy, cloying scent of death lingered. No one spoke of what had happened in detail. It was easier to speak of the joy, the baby, the future. Jane had done what no other had. She had borne a prince, but she had done so at a cost no man in the palace had truly considered. Her body had become a battleground, and when the fighting was over, there was no one left to bury her as a woman, only as a symbol. They say the Queen died peacefully. But walls, remember, And in that chamber, the silence still carries weight. It carries the echoes of screams, of whispered prayers, of cold decisions. And somewhere in that silence is the truth not of a perfect queen, but of a woman who broke utterly and entirely to give a king his son. When the cry of the newborn echoed through the chambers of Hampton Court, it was as if all of England exhaled. It had come, the long-awaited prince, the boy upon whose shoulders the future of the Tudor dynasty now rested, had finally arrived. And for a brief, shining moment, the kingdom knew only celebration. Church bells rang through fog-draped villages, courtiers smiled wider, ambassadors rushed to pen their congratulations. Henry VIII, triumphant and vindicated, now had the son that had eluded him through 2 failed marriages and countless heartbreaks, and Jane Seymour, the silent queen who had given him this gift, was declared the perfect wife, modest, obedient, fruitful. But what followed that infant's first cry was not the joy they had hoped would linger, nor the peace they had expected to unfold. What followed was silence, a long, haunting, creeping silence that began with soft footsteps in a quiet corridor and ended with the extinguishing of a queen's final breath. They said she was recovering, that Jane had sat up in bed and received visitors just days after her labor. They noted her composure, her elegance, how she signed her name with steady hands on the letters announcing the birth of the heir. Those letters were carried far and wide, proof of both England's strength and the Queen's endurance. But there is a subtle dishonesty in those details, a way of arranging facts to hide the truth. For even as Jane smiled politely and accepted congratulations, her body was already turning inward, curling under the weight of fever, infection, and whatever quiet injuries had been done to her in the dark hours of childbirth. No one speaks of the days immediately after the labor with much precision. The records are vague. Her movements are described in fragments. She sat up. They say she dined lightly. She laughed once. But none of these details speak of strength. They speak of someone trying to perform normalcy in a body already slipping into collapse. It is known that by the 15th of October, 3 days after the birth, Jane was confined again to her bed. She had guests. Yes, but fewer. The nurses no longer left her side. The linens were changed more often. The room was quieter. There was talk of weakness. Not pain of her spirits lightening, of her seeming cheerful, of optimism. But these were the illusions people needed to believe. No one wanted to think the Queen might be dying. Not so soon. Not now, when everything had finally gone right. But the silence had already begun to grow. By the 19th, she was fading again. The fever returned. Her appetite vanished. Her voice softened. At first, the physicians believed it to be a minor setback, a small imbalance, a natural result of the exhaustion that came with childbirth. But the women attending her knew. They saw the way her fingers trembled, the glassy look in her eyes, the heat that radiated from her skin, even in the coldest hours of the night. They changed the sheets more often. They whispered the prayers more fervently. And still, no one said the word aloud. Death, it hovered at the door, not yet crossing the threshold, but present, patient, and the silence it brought was cruel. There was no more laughter in Jane's chambers, no more music in the halls outside. The celebration had ended without warning. The prince had been born, but the price had not yet finished being paid. On the 20th, Henry came, not because he had been summoned with urgency, but because someone, perhaps a lady in waiting, perhaps his physician, had finally broken through the fog of optimism. The Queen was very ill. Her condition was grave. He entered the room in solemnity. We do not know what he said. We do not know if he wept. We know only that he knelt beside her bed, took her hand, and prayed. It was the first time he had watched a queen of his suffer without anger, without blame. Jane had done everything right. She had been quiet, loyal, chaste. She had given him a son, and she was still dying. In the quiet of that chamber, with the candles flickering and the smell of sickness settling like fog, Henry's prayers rose in whispers, carried to the ceiling, unheard by the God he so desperately tried to command. Perhaps Jane heard him. Perhaps she didn't. We will never know how much she understood in those final hours, how much pain she was still in, how much hope she still carried. Some say she grew peaceful. Others say the fever burned until her eyes could no longer close. And still, the silence deepened. The infant Edward was taken from the room. He was placed in the care of nurses and wet nurses, surrounded by men whispering about the future, about regencies and successions and treaties. He would not remember the woman who gave her life to bring him into the world. He would not see the way her body curled into the bedclothes, or how the nurses held her hands when the tremors began. He would not hear the prayers that were repeated over and over again. The same phrases falling like rain. Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis, miserere mei, Deus, deliver her, O Lord, from eternal death. And finally, in the early hours of the 24th of October, at 2 o'clock in the morning, exactly 12 days after Edward had entered the world, Jane left it. Her breath faded to nothing. Her chest rose once, twice, and then stilled. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb the very air from the room. She died in the same bed where she had given England its future. She died beneath the same tapestries that had once echoed with her screams. And the moment she was gone, the world outside began to move again. Servants were called. The king was informed. The mourning protocols were initiated. But for that moment, that pure, aching moment between her last breath and the first knock on the chamber door, all was still. It was not a peaceful stillness. It was the stillness of consequence, of a price fully paid. The silence that followed her death was the kind that does not end. It lingers in stone, in the grain of the floorboards, in the canopy of the bed that held her. It follows the corridors of Hampton Court, not with weeping, but with an absence so sharp it becomes a presence in itself. Because when Jane Seymour died, the world did not stop. But something inside Henry cracked, not visibly, not immediately. He would go on. He would rule. He would remarry. But he would never speak of her with anger. He would never punish her memory. And though he did not attend her funeral, and never built her the tomb he promised, he chose to be buried beside her, not because he could not live without her, but because in the silence she left behind, he finally heard the sound of what it meant to love and to lose. There are deaths that roar, deaths that tear through courts and kingdoms like thunder, pulling banners from their poles and splitting hearts in two. And then there are deaths that arrive more quietly, slowly, like dusk, bleeding into night, not with violence, but with the persistence of something too ancient to stop. Jane Seymour's death was the second kind, a slow drowning, a fever that seeped into her body like fog through a window left ajar. It did not come with screaming or blood. Not at first. It came with a change in her skin, a stillness in her gaze, a subtle withdrawal from the world, as if her body had finally whispered enough. It began around the 16th of October. Jane had, by then, been officially recovering. She had signed letters, received guests, smiled faintly at Edward's christening. Her ladies-in-waiting clung to these moments as proof that all was well. But behind the heavy doors of her chamber, the truth hung like a weight over the bed. The bleeding had not fully stopped. Her color was wrong. She was not resting. She was enduring. And by the 19th, she could no longer sit upright. That night, her pulse changed first, slowing, then racing. Her cheeks flushed with unnatural heat. Her lips were dry, cracked at the edges. The women attending her no longer whispered hope. They pressed cool cloths to her brow, lit more candles, and sent word to the physicians. The king was informed, but still, no one dared say the word aloud. Fever. It was not a diagnosis in Tudor England. It was a curse. It meant the rot had taken hold. Perhaps puerperal fever, the scourge of childbirth, passed from unwashed hands to open wounds, now turning the queen's blood against her. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, an embolism, sepsis, dehydration, or a bleeding uterus slowly unraveling within her. The science did not exist to tell them. The priests could only pray, and the physicians, dressed in black and silver, stood helpless beside the bed. On the 20th, her condition worsened. She no longer responded to her name. Her eyes drifted. Her lips moved without sound. And still the fever burned, blotching her skin, pooling sweat at her hairline. She was alternately freezing and burning. Her limbs jerked without meaning. Her hands gripped nothing. She no longer asked for her child. She no longer asked for Henry. It was on this day that the king was summoned again, this time with urgency. It came quietly. He did not speak at first, only stood at the threshold, as if unwilling to cross into the world of illness and death that now wrapped itself around his queen. When he did approach, he took her hand. It was limp, but warm. He kneed beside her, murmured prayers, perhaps kissed her fingers. His face was pale. Some say he wept. Others say he simply stared, unable to look away, unable to undo what had been done. But he did not stay long. No orders were shouted. No demands for remedies. No rage at God. Just a king, turning from his dying queen, and stepping once more into the world where she no longer existed. That night, Jane slipped further. Her speech, what little remained of it, dissolved into murmurs and breathless moans. The women laid rosaries on her chest, placed crosses in her hands. Some whispered psalms, others cried. The room smelled of sweat, wine, and death. A priest arrived. He gave her last rites. Though no one said so aloud, there was still a child in the palace. They reminded each other there was still a prince. But even the cry of a newborn could not penetrate the fever's grasp. On the 21st, Jane had moments of lucidity. Her eyes opened. She smiled faintly. She drank a little broth. The women dared to hope. The physicians stepped forward again, muttering about turning tides, about strength returning. But it was not recovery. It was the cruelest part of dying the moment the body. Before the end, feigns resilience, a last gasp of light before the candle drowns. The next day, her lips turned blue. Her hands were colder. She stopped drinking. Her breathing was short, uneven. The night passed with the sounds of prayer and whisper and wind. Outside, the court walked softly. Servants moved like shadows. A silence had settled on Hampton Court, not the hopeful hush of recovery, but the respectful quiet of mourning in waiting. By the 23rd, there was no longer doubt. The Queen was dying. At her bedside sat only women. The King had not returned. Her child was elsewhere. Her family, her brothers, were near, but not in the room. The chamber was dim, the air heavy. Her fever had spread beyond her blood. Now it lived in the very walls, in the bedsheets, in the pulse of those who watched her. One lady wrote later that her face was no longer recognizable, not with fear or pain, but with the absence of all that had once animated it. And then came the final night. They did not speak much. There were no more remedies to offer, no more words to soothe. Jane drifted between sleep and unconsciousness. The priest returned. The candles were relit. The windows were shuttered. It was just past midnight when she stopped responding. Her chest still rose, faintly, but her mouth had fallen open. Her eyes closed, but not peacefully. One woman wiped her brow. Another kissed her hand. They waited. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the same hour she had given birth 12 days earlier, Jane Seymour died. No cries, no final words, just the long, dreadful exhale of a life ending not with violence or betrayal, but with the slow, cruel erosion of fire beneath the skin. The fever had done what politics, swords, and enemies could not. It had taken the Queen. In the hours that followed, her body was prepared. It was washed, anointed, and dressed in gold. But inside, the fire still lingered. It was said that her organs were removed. Her heart, placed beneath the altar. Her body, eventually sent to Windsor. Her soul left behind. Perhaps in the flames that had devoured her from within. And as for Henry, he left. He did not wait for the funeral. He did not speak of her illness in public. He did not rage against the physicians or curse the heavens. He retreated silent, grieving, or simply relieved. History never quite knew which woes. But one thing is certain. The fever that took Jane Seymour was not just a disease. It was the quietest kind of execution, and perhaps the only one in Henry's story not signed by his hand. They did not bury her all at once. When Jane Seymour slipped from life in the early hours of that October morning, her body did not go straight to the grave. Instead, she was unmade, piece by piece, as quietly as she had lived. Her skin, once flushed with the fever of death, was washed and oiled by careful hands. Her hair, still damp from sweat, was combed back and pinned beneath a veil of mourning white. Her corpse was dressed not in black, but in gold, a robe heavy with embroidery. A reminder not of grief, but of victory, for that was what the court whispered. Now she had died a victor. She had delivered England its prince. She had fulfilled her purpose. Her work was done, but her body had not finished being used. In those days, it was common to embalm the dead of royal blood. The scent of death was no small thing in a palace, and preservation was necessary for display, for procession, for the long rituals of mourning. So the women, and perhaps a surgeon, perhaps a priest, opened her. Quietly, efficiently, her entrails were removed. Her internal organs, the heart among them, were wrapped and taken from her body. They were buried in haste. Beneath the high altar of Hampton Court's chapel, a place of devotion, yes, but also secrecy. There was no grand proclamation, no monument, no carved stone to mark the burial of her most sacred part. Only the faint scratching of quill in record books. Only the whispers of servants and the soft echoes of feet passing the chapel where her heart lay cooling beneath the stone. They dressed her for death like a queen. A crown was placed on her brow, cold against the skin. Jewels sparkled on fingers that would never move again. An image of perfection was built, not the broken woman who had died in fever and delirium, but a still, saintly figure of English virtue. A mother, a martyr, a sovereign, and yet the body was no longer whole. No one knows who made the decision to separate her heart from her corpse. Perhaps it was custom, perhaps it was reverence, or perhaps it was something darker, a way of hiding the damage done, of removing the signs of surgical intervention, of ensuring that the public face of Jane Seymour, the perfect queen, remained unsullied by the brutal cost of her final gift. Because a body torn by childbirth, opened by blades, or rotted by fever, was not fit for the gaze of England. That kind of suffering had no place in the myth Henry wished to tell, and so her heart was hidden. While her body was painted in gold, she was laid in state within the same palace where she had lived and died. Her chamber was transformed into a sanctuary of mourning. Black drapes covered the walls. Candles were placed at her feet and head. An effigy was laid beside her, a wax figure dressed in likeness, so that those who came to pay their respects would not weep before decay. But before a symbol, no one wept for the truth of her death. They wept for what she represented. They came not for Jane, the woman, but for Jane, the idea, the mother of the heir, the queen who succeeded where others had failed, the silent consort who had not argued, not resisted, not fallen out of favour. In a reign littered with scandal, hers was the story they wanted to believe in, and it was easier to believe in it without her heart. Days passed, and her body, or what was left of it, was moved, taken from Hampton Court, and carried in solemn procession to Windsor. Her entrails remained behind, buried beneath the altar, their presence unmarked. No epitaph, no shrine, only the memory of their removal, carried in silence by the few who had seen it done. And Henry, he did not follow the coffin. He did not watch the curtains draw around her chamber. He did not kneel at the altar where her heart lay. He withdrew to Windsor alone, far from the noise, far from the image of the woman he had once called the love of his life. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was exhaustion, the kind that settles in when even kings begin to understand what they have asked of the women who lie dying in their beds, covered in gold, hollowed out, and carried off in silence. And so the Queen who had given England its future left the world incomplete, her body in one place, her heart in another, her memory scattered between the two. They say she rests beside Henry now, that in death she lies where he chose to lie, not beside Anne, not beside Catherine, but beside Jane. But the woman buried at Windsor is not whole. Her heart, the most fragile and the most fierce of organs, remains buried in the floor of a chapel. Few now enter, unknown, unmourned, and forgotten. But the stones remember, and the silence, deep within Hampton Court, still knows her name. She did not walk that final mile. She was carried, draped in velvet, crowned in stillness, unseeing beneath the weight of gold cloth and embroidered legacy. Jane Seymour, Queen of England, left Hampton Court as she had arrived, without ceremony from her own lips, without protest, without sound. But now, instead of quiet footsteps or soft curtsies, she moved through the world like a relic. The body they had prepared for display was no longer Jane. It was a vessel, and it belonged not to family, nor to grief, nor even to Henry. It belonged to England. Her procession began before dawn, the mist still clinging to the grass. The horses were black, their manes braided in silence. Her coffin, covered in cloth of gold, was set upon a bier drawn by 6 steeds, their hooves muffled in the hush of early morning. Beside her lay the wax effigy lifelike, adorned with a crown, lips gently parted in an eternal, unanswering expression. The real queen, embalmed and emptied, lay beneath it, her face unseen, her breath long vanished. 30 mourners followed, women cloaked in layers of black, veils hiding their faces, hands clasped in prayer. Leading them was Princess Mary, daughter of Catherine, of Aragon, Jane's stepdaughter, now the chief mourner. At 18 years old, Mary had seen more queens come and go than most would in a lifetime. And now, she rode at the head of death once more. There were 29 women behind her, one for each year of Jane's life, though no one could be entirely sure if the count was precise. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the symbolism, the symmetry. Every step, every turn of the wheel, had been choreographed to convey not the mess of mortality, but the illusion of grace. And so the road from Hampton Court to Windsor became not a journey of mourning, but a theatre of perfection. The people lined the path in silence, not cheers, no cries, only bowed heads, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of winter cloaks. They had celebrated this queen in her silence. Now they buried her the same way. Henry was not among them. The king had retreated to Windsor before the funeral began. He left the arrangements in the hands of the Duke of Norfolk and other trusted nobles. It was easier that way. The man who had chosen Jane, who had elevated her, who had asked for a son, even at the cost of her life, that man could not face the body she had left behind. Or perhaps he simply would not. When the procession reached Windsor, it was met by the clergy candles flickering in the morning wind, incense rising in pale threads toward the sky. The coffin was received at the chapel doors by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Prayers were spoken, bells tolled. Inside, the air was thick with sacred music, and the weight of something that felt too vast for the moment, not just grief, but history settling. The Queen's body was laid in state before the high altar. Her heart, already buried beneath the altar at Hampton Court, was not mentioned. No one asked why the coffin felt too light. No one questioned what had been taken and left behind. That night, Princess Mary kept vigil, alone, or nearly so. Her candle burning beside the coffin. The great windows of St. George's Chapel watched in silence. The vault beneath the floor waited. On the 12th of November, the funeral mass began. 200 requiem masses were ordered to be sung for her soul. The chapel was filled with voices, choristers, clergy. The hollow chant of Latin rising in rhythms meant to drown out the details. Jane was wrapped in liturgy now, in structure, in the ancient ritual of royal death, and as the final rites were read, her coffin was lowered into the vault beneath the Garter Chapel, the same vault where, nearly a decade later, Henry would choose to lie beside her. And then the final gesture, the gesture that marked the end of service. Her household, those who had stood beside her in life, broke their white staves of office and cast them into the grave. A single, soft clatter of wood on wood, echoing in the stone chamber, like a goodbye too formal to weep. Above them, the bells of London tolled once more. Jane Seymour had been queen for little more than a year. She had given birth to the prince who would rule for only 6. She had died without scandal, without disgrace, without ever raising her voice. And so, they gave her a funeral that spoke not of pain, but of perfection. But the perfection was a costume, a veil, a silence stretched tight across the mouth of history. Beneath the gold cloth, the embalmed skin, the velvet crown, lay a woman whose womb had torn, whose blood had burned, whose heart had been buried separately in a chapel, altar far away. She did not walk her final mile. She was carried, and in being carried, she became something both more and less than human. A symbol, a silence, a vessel, a perfect queen, they said. And yet, in that perfection, there was no place for what she had suffered, no space for what she had lost, no room for what had been taken, not just her life, but her voice, her pain, her truth. The procession moved on. The prayers faded. The court resumed, and the woman they called perfect was sealed beneath the floor, still waiting, perhaps, to be remembered as something more than a beautiful lie. They said he loved her most. They said it quietly, and often, as if speaking it too loudly might wake the ghosts. Henry VIII, the king who discarded queens like worn gloves, who had one wife banished, another beheaded, a third forgotten, a fourth executed in her youth. This man, so difficult to love and impossible to satisfy, they said he loved Jane Seymour above all others. And the proof, they insisted, lay in what he planned after her death. He would build her a tomb, not just a resting place, not a grave, but a tomb vast, grand, royal, a monument to beauty, obedience, fertility, a shrine not only to Jane, but to the woman Henry wanted to remember her as, the woman who never defied him, the woman who gave him a son, the woman who died before disappointment could set in It was to be glorious. Marble and gold. Sculptures in the Italian style. Angels carved in alabaster, weeping at her feet. Latin inscriptions etched deep in stone, praising her grace, her virtue, her sacrifice. Space was even planned for him. Beside her, the two of them, side by side, in death if not truly in life, together in eternal silence beneath arches echoing with prayer. But the tomb was never built. Years passed. Designs were sketched and resketched. Artisans were consulted, stone ordered, budget discussed. But nothing rose from the earth. Nothing was laid. Nothing was carved. What was once a promise turned, slowly and invisibly, into a convenient forgetting. Henry remarried. He remarried again. The country moved on, and Jane's tomb remained on parchment. Some said it was the fault of war. Others blamed political distraction, shifting loyalties, financial strain. The king had too many enemies. He had too many palaces, too many projects, too many regrets, and the tomb, once spoken of in solemn tones, became a quiet embarrassment, an unfinished task tucked beneath the weight of history. But perhaps it was more than delay. Perhaps it was grief, or perhaps it was guilt. To build that tomb would have meant facing the truth of what he had done or what he had allowed to happen. Jane had died because he wanted an heir, because he demanded one, because when asked if he would spare the wife or the child, he chose the child. To honor her in marble would have meant chiseling his own choice into stone. It would have meant standing in front of the world and admitting that the thing he loved most was also the thing he helped destroy. And so, there was no statue, no Latin, no angels, no grandeur, only a plain vault beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel in Windsor. No monument stands above it, no carved likeness, no words, just the dust and quiet of centuries, and the bones of a queen who was promised the world and given only silence. She was buried with honor. Yes, but honor is not memory, and a tomb unbuilt is not the same as a tomb fulfilled. When Henry himself died in the year 1547, his body was placed beside hers. The plans for the joint monument were briefly discussed again, a final opportunity to fulfill what had once been declared as love. But even then, even in death, nothing came. He lay down beside her, in the dark, not in a golden chamber, but in a bare vault, beneath a slab of stone unmarked by their names. And that was where they remained. Kings and queens came and went. The chapel was renovated, decorated, filled with new voices and new prayers. But no one ever returned to build Jane Seymour, the tomb she had been promised. No one ever raised the angels. No one ever etched the verses. And so, she lies beside the man who chose her, then forgot her, the man who said he loved her, then left her body hollowed and embalmed, the man who promised marble, then delivered stone. Perhaps it is fitting, perhaps in that absence is the truest monument to their story, not a lie carved in gold, but a silence too heavy to lift. The tomb was never built, but the ghost of it lingers, in sketches, in half-written epitaphs, in corners of the chapel where the light refuses to fall, and in the hearts of those who dare to remember Jane Seymour, not as the perfect queen, not as the silent wife, not as the mother of a boy king, but as a woman whose death was wrapped in too much gold and far too little truth. He never knew her. Not really. He would never remember the sound of her voice, or the shape of her smile, or the warmth of her hand against his cheek. Edward Tudor was only 12 days old when his mother died, and Jane Seymour became a name on the edge of his cradle, a whisper in the corridors, a painted face hung above his head. She gave him life, and in doing so, gave hers. But to the child, she died for. She would always be a mystery, more myth than memory, more lost than love. They called him a miracle, a boy born to secure the crown, a son who justified the break from Rome, the discarded wives, the shattered oaths. For this child, queens had fallen, laws had changed, blood had been spilled, and now, with his first breath, the kingdom seemed whole again. But the cost, though never spoken, hung heavy in the palace air. Everyone knew it. No one said it. The prince had arrived, but the queen had gone. He was raised without her. Edward was placed in the care of nurses, vet nurses, tutors. He was shielded from illness, from noise, from the chaos of court. His father, now aging and bloated, watched him from a distance, proud, possessive, afraid. The boy was not simply a child. He was an answer, a justification, a prophecy fulfilled. Henry VIII had long believed that God would not allow a woman to inherit the throne. That belief had driven his actions like a fever. And now, with Edward in his arms, he believed himself vindicated. The son had come. The sacrifice had been worth it. But Jane's absence was everywhere. It was in the hush that fell whenever her name was spoken. It was in the quiet glance between servants who remembered the fever, the smell, the blood. It was in the portraits, not many, but enough that showed her idealized, golden, unreal, the perfect queen, the perfect mother, but not the woman who died in agony beneath the tapestries of Hampton Court. They told Edward she had been good, that she had been loved, that she had died giving him life. But they did not tell him about the labor that lasted 3 days. They did not tell him about the fever that boiled in her blood. They did not tell him that his father had chosen him over her when the decision had to be made. He would grow up believing he had been wanted, that he had been worth it. And yet, even a child raised in silence can feel the weight of an unspoken truth. Edward, by all accounts, was a thoughtful boy, serious, scholarly, deeply devout. He was clever beyond his years, but he was also frail. His health was always watched closely, his meals controlled, his steps measured. He was not allowed the freedom of most children. He was, from birth, a symbol, and symbols are not allowed to be weak. As he grew, he would sometimes ask about his mother. He wrote her name in the margins of books. He prayed for her soul. He kept her image near his bedside, but she remained an idea to him, flawless, distant, unreachable. There was no one who could give him the truth. The women who had held her hand as she died had long been sent away. The men who had carried her coffin had moved on. His father never spoke of her in depth, and so Edward was left to imagine her whole, smiling, proud of him. But the truth was far crueler. She had died because his birth had broken her. No one could say exactly how. Some said it was puerperal fever. Others suspected sepsis. A few, still whispering years later, wondered if she had been cut open to deliver the prince whose tiny body had refused to come the natural way. There were rumors of a hidden surgery, of knives behind closed doors, of decisions made too late. But Edward would never hear those stories. Not from the court, not from the church, not from his father. And perhaps that was for the best. How does a child live with the knowledge that his first breath took another's last? That his cries were heard over hers? That the very thing that made him valuable, his birth, was the thing that tore his mother from the world? Edward would not live long enough to fully ask those questions. He ascended the throne at 9 years old. Already solemn, already old in the eyes. The boy king, pale, small, precise in his manner. He spoke Latin. He wrote with careful penmanship. He prayed daily. He ruled through regents. But his will was clear. Protestant. Principled. Relentless. He wanted to please his father's memory. He wanted to earn the crown he had been born into. But his health, always fragile, began to fade. Coughing fits, fevers, wasting limbs. His attendants hid it as long as they could. But by the age of 15, it was clear Edward was dying, and as he lay in his final bed, another Tudor fading, in another chamber, lit with flickering candles. One wonders if he thought of her. Did he see her face? Did he reach for a hand he had never held? Did he, in his last hours, whisper her name? We will never know. His final prayers are lost. His letters end. His reign closed in a whisper, like hers. But in the silence between them, there is a line unbroken. A mother who died to give a son to England, and a son who died before he ever had the chance to understand what she gave. The child who cost her life never knew her. And yet, he carried her with him in his breath, in his blood, in the sorrow written quietly into the story of them both. In the end, she rests beneath a stone. No one stops to read. No statue marks her face. No carving spells her virtues. No rose is placed by the hand of a grieving king. And yet, she lies beside him. Of all the women, Henry ever married 6 queens. Each with her own rise and fall, Jane Seymour is the one he chose to join in death. He made that decision not at the height of love, but in the silence after her loss. And that choice, more than any funeral, any mass, any monument, has lingered longest. It has been said, again and again, that she was the wife he loved most. But what does it mean to be loved by a man who built no tomb, spoke no elegy, and left behind nothing but a vacant promise? She was not disgraced. That alone made her different. Catherine had been exiled. Anne had been executed. Anne of Cleves was cast aside. Catherine Howard destroyed. And Catherine Parr left to survive. But Jane had died cleanly, neatly, before disillusionment could arrive, before time could unravel the golden image Henry had created around her. She gave him his son, and then she died. A perfect arc, a tragedy that required no fixing. He never needed to erase her. She left no rebellion, no scandal, no scars on the record books. She had no surviving letters of defiance. No ambassadors spoke ill of her. She was the wife who died at her most useful, and that, in Henry's world, was as close to sainthood as a queen could hope to come. But she was also forgotten. Not publicly, not in name. Her image was painted, her place recorded. The poets gave her verses. The priests gave her prayers. Her son, Edward, spoke of her with affection. Her memory was preserved, polished, framed, curated, but not known, not grieved, not truly remembered as a woman. With fears and blood and voice, she became an icon, and like all icons, she was simplified into stillness. There are no letters from Henry to Jane that survive, no intimate reflections, no tokens preserved in his hand, only that one act, the burial beside her, offered as proof of feeling. And even that, we must wonder about. Did he choose her because he loved her most? Or because she asked the least of him? Did he mourn her because of who she was? Or because she died before he had the chance to grow weary of her? He called her the fairest, the dearest. He never remarried for 3 years after her death, the longest stretch of solitude in his married life. Some say he wept for her, that he wore mourning not just in cloth but in spirit. That something in him softened, briefly, in the wake of her absence. But others say he moved on with the court's business, that he retreated, not from grief, but from inconvenience, that her death gave him the freedom he had never known with the others, the freedom to idealize her. Unchallenged, untested, and Jane, she left no journal, no diary, no farewell. We do not know what she thought in her final hours. We do not know if she prayed, or wept, or raged. We know only that she died in pain, that her body was opened, that her heart was taken, that her child survived, only to die young, and that her husband, the man who promised her eternity in stone, left her beneath a chapel floor with no monument but time. She was not forgotten, but she was never truly remembered either. Not in the way memory matters, not in the way it restores breath. Restore voice? Restores the right to be more than the role she was given. And now, 500 years later, Jane Seymour remains trapped in that space between reverence and silence. Still called perfect. Still unknown. Still lying beneath the feet of visitors who walk St. George's Chapel without realizing what they pass over. Still waiting, perhaps, for someone to ask who she really was. Not the mother of a prince. Not the quiet consort. Not the Golden Queen, but the woman whose death, whispered behind curtains and cloaked in incense, tells us more about power, about sacrifice, and about what it costs to be loved by a king who never truly said goodbye. And so we close her story with no resolution. Only a breath, a pause, a candle snuffed out in the quiet of a palace that has forgotten how to mourn. Sleep now. Jane, you are seen, not as perfect, but as real, and at last, remembered.